The burgundy velvet dress had been hanging in my closet for 3 weeks, tags still attached, waiting for tonight's company Christmas party. I'd chosen it specifically because David always said I looked stunning in deep jewel tones, and after 18 months of him working late, missing dinners, and falling asleep on the couch instead of coming to bed, I thought maybe tonight would remind him of who we used to be. I stood in our bedroom mirror, adjusting the neckline one final time, when I heard his car pull into the driveway. The familiar sound of his Mercedes door slamming shut echoed through our Tudor-style home in Riverside Heights, followed by his heavy footsteps on the front porch. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emma, you ready? David called from downstairs, his voice carrying that particular tone of impatience he'd developed recently whenever we had social obligations. I spritzed on the Chanel perfume he'd given me for our 10th anniversary 3 years ago, grabbed my clutch, and made my way down the mahogany staircase we'd spent months selecting when we bought this house. David stood at the bottom of the stairs, adjusting his silver tie in the hallway mirror. At 42, he still looked like the ambitious marketing director I'd fallen in love with in college, though the stress lines around his green eyes had deepened considerably over the past year. His dark hair showed the first hints of silver at the temples, which I'd always found distinguished, but tonight he seemed distracted, checking his phone even as I descended the stairs. "You look beautiful," he said, glancing up briefly before returning to his device. The compliment felt automatic, rehearsed, lacking the warmth that used to accompany his appreciation of my appearance. "Thank you," I replied, smoothing the velvet fabric over my hips. "I'm excited to finally meet your new team members. It's been so long since we've done something like this together." David nodded absently, pocketing his phone. "Right, well, it's mostly work people. You remember how these things go, lots of shop talk and networking." His tone suggested he wasn't particularly enthusiastic about including me in his professional world, which stung more than I cared to admit. The drive to the downtown Marriott took 25 minutes through the December evening traffic. Christmas lights twinkled from every storefront along Main Street, and the radio played soft jazz versions of holiday classics. I found myself stealing glances at David as he drove, noting how his jaw remained tense even during what should have been a pleasant evening out. His wedding ring caught the light from a passing street lamp, the simple platinum band we'd chosen together 13 years ago when we were young and certain about our future. "How's the Morrison account coming along?" I asked, attempting to bridge the growing silence between us. David had been working on landing this major client for months, often staying at the office until 9 or 10 o'clock to prepare presentations and proposals. "It's fine," he replied curtly, switching lanes without signaling. "Complex stuff. Wouldn't interest you." The dismissal was casual but pointed, another reminder that somewhere along the way, David had decided my background in interior design and my current work as a freelance consultant wasn't substantial enough to understand his sophisticated business dealings. I'd stopped trying to discuss my own projects with him months ago, after he'd referred to my latest restaurant renovation as playing with fabric samples in front of our neighbors. We arrived at the hotel to find the party already in full swing. The grand ballroom had been transformed into a winter wonderland, with white linens, silver centerpieces, and tiny white lights strung throughout the space. The marketing firm David worked for, Henderson and Associates, clearly spared no expense for their annual celebration. I recognized several faces from previous years, though I noticed how many people seemed to avoid making eye contact with me, offering only polite nods before quickly turning back to their conversations. David immediately gravitated toward a cluster of his colleagues near the bar, introducing me briefly before becoming absorbed in a discussion about quarterly projections and client retention strategies. I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server and found myself standing slightly outside their circle, smiling pleasantly while feeling increasingly invisible. "Emma Morrison, isn't it?" a voice said beside me. I turned to see Patricia Chen, the firm's HR director, approaching with what appeared to be genuine warmth. "You look lovely tonight. How have you been?" "It's Emma Coleman," I corrected gently, "and I'm doing well, thank you. How are things with you?" Patricia had always been kind to me at these events, one of the few people who seemed to remember I existed beyond my role as David's wife. "Oh goodness, I'm sorry," Patricia said, her cheeks flushing slightly. Of course, Coleman. I don't know where my head was. I've been so scattered lately with all the holiday preparations and year-end reviews. She paused, studying my face with concern. Are you enjoying the party? I know these work events can be a bit tedious for spouses. I assured her I was having a pleasant time, though truthfully I felt more like an observer than a participant. David had moved on to another group, leaving me to navigate the social dynamics alone. I made polite conversation with Patricia for several more minutes before she excused herself to check on the catering arrangements. The evening progressed with the usual rhythm of corporate social events. There were speeches from the senior partners, recognition of outstanding achievements, and the presentation of year-end bonuses. David's name was called for his work on several successful campaigns, and I felt a familiar surge of pride watching him accept the recognition. Whatever issues we were having in our marriage, I'd never stopped admiring his professional competence and dedication. During dinner, I found myself seated at a table with other spouses and a few junior associates I didn't recognize. The conversation flowed around topics of children's school activities, vacation plans, and home renovation projects. I contributed when appropriate, but my attention kept drifting to David's table across the room, where he seemed more animated and engaged than I'd seen him in months. Your husband's certainly been busy this year, commented Sarah Williams, whose husband worked in David's department. Jim says he's practically living at the office. Must be hard on you, having him gone so much. He's very dedicated to his work, I replied diplomatically, taking a sip of the surprisingly good Pinot Noir they were serving. I admire his commitment to his clients. Sarah nodded knowingly. That's what we tell ourselves, isn't it? That it's all about work ethic and professional success. Though sometimes I wonder if there are other motivations keeping our husbands at the office so late. Her tone carried an edge that made me look at her more closely, but before I could respond, she was already turning to engage the woman on her other side. After dinner, the dancing began. A small band played classic hits from the 80s and 90s, and the lights were dimmed to create a more intimate atmosphere. I watched couples take to the dance floor, swaying to familiar melodies that reminded me of earlier, happier times in my relationship with David. He approached our table as the band began playing At Last, by Etta James, a song that had played at our wedding reception. Dance with me, he asked, extending his hand with a smile that almost reached his eyes. For a moment, he looked like the man I'd married, the one who used to surprise me with weekend getaways, and handwritten notes left in my coffee mug. We moved onto the dance floor, and David pulled me close, his hand settling at the small of my back in the familiar way that used to make my heart skip. The scent of his cologne, mixed with the faint smell of cigarettes, which was odd since David had quit smoking years ago. I decided not to mention it, choosing instead to enjoy this rare moment of connection. You do look beautiful tonight, he murmured into my hair, and this time the compliment felt genuine. I'm sorry I've been so distracted lately, work has been overwhelming. I know, I replied, allowing myself to relax against him. I just miss spending time together, it feels like we're living parallel lives sometimes. David's arms tightened around me slightly. Things will settle down after the Morrison deal is finalized. I promise we'll plan something special for New Year's. Maybe that bed and breakfast in Vermont you mentioned. The song ended, and for a brief moment we stood together on the dance floor, holding on to each other, and the possibility that we could find our way back to who we used to be. Then David's phone buzzed in his jacket pocket, and the spell was broken. He stepped back, checking the message with a frown. Everything okay? I asked, though I could already see him pulling away mentally. Just a client issue. Nothing urgent. He pocketed the phone and guided me off the dance floor. I should probably make the rounds, say goodbye to a few people before we head out. I nodded, understanding this was my cue to gather my things while he fulfilled his professional obligations. I retrieved my clutch from our table and made my way toward the coat check, pausing to compliment Patricia on the lovely event and thank her for including me in the evening's festivities. The ladies' room was located down a corridor, lined with conference rooms, their glass doors offering glimpses into darkened spaces filled with tables and chairs. As I walked back from freshening my lipstick, I could hear laughter and conversation drifting from one of the rooms. The door was slightly ajar, and warm light spilled into the hallway. Curious about what might be happening in there, I slowed my pace as I passed Through the gap in the door, I could see several people standing around a small bar cart that had been wheeled into the room. It appeared to be an impromptu after-party for some of the younger employees, who had gathered for more intimate conversation away from the formality of the main ballroom. I recognized a few faces from David's department, including Jessica Martinez, a new account executive, who had joined the firm 6 months ago. Jessica was perhaps 28 years old, with glossy black hair and the kind of effortless confidence that comes from being both intelligent and attractive. I'd met her briefly at a company picnic over the summer, where she'd impressed me with her knowledge of art history and her genuine interest in my design work. David had mentioned her several times since then, usually in the context of praising her strategic thinking and client management skills. I was about to continue past the room when I saw a familiar figure emerge from behind the bar cart. David stood there with a tumbler of what looked like whiskey, his tie loosened and his hair slightly mussed. He was laughing at something Jessica had said, his face more relaxed and animated than I'd seen it all evening. There was an easy intimacy to their interaction that made me pause, though I couldn't immediately articulate why it felt significant. Jessica reached out to adjust David's collar, her fingers lingering at his throat longer than necessary for a purely professional gesture. David didn't pull away, instead he caught her hand in his, bringing it to his lips to press a gentle kiss to her palm. The gesture was tender, romantic and completely inappropriate for colleagues, no matter how friendly their working relationship might be. My breath caught in my throat, and I pressed myself against the wall outside the door, suddenly afraid of being discovered. Through the narrow opening, I continued to watch as David set down his drink and pulled Jessica closer to him. She tilted her face up toward his, and they shared a kiss that was neither brief nor platonic. This was not the awkward fumbling of a spontaneous mistake, but rather the practiced intimacy of two people who had done this many times before. When they finally separated, Jessica smiled up at David with obvious affection. "I hate these pretenses," she said softly, though her voice carried clearly to where I stood frozen in the hallway. "Watching you with her all evening, having to pretend we barely know each other. It's getting harder to maintain the charade." David stroked her cheek with his thumb, a gesture so tender and familiar that it felt like a physical blow to witness. "I know, sweetheart, but we talked about this. We have to be careful, especially with the promotion coming up. Once that's settled, and I figure out how to handle the situation at home, things will be different." "How much longer?" Jessica asked, and I could hear the frustration in her voice. "It's been 8 months, David. 8 months of sneaking around, making excuses, pretending not to care about each other in front of everyone. I'm tired of being your secret." 8 months, the timeline hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. 8 months ago was when David had started working late regularly, when he'd become distant and distracted, when our marriage had begun its slow slide into polite coexistence. 8 months ago was when Jessica Martinez had joined Henderson and Associates as the promising new account executive with impressive credentials and ambitious goals. David pulled Jessica back into his arms, murmuring reassurances I couldn't quite hear. I watched transfixed by the horror of the scene, as he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew something small and glittering. Even from my position in the hallway, I could see it was a jewelry box, the kind that typically contained rings. "I wanted to give this to you tonight," David said, opening the box to reveal what appeared to be a diamond ring. "I know we can't make anything official yet, but I want you to know how serious I am about our future together." Jessica gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. "David, it's beautiful, but I can't wear it." "Not yet. What if someone sees?"
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"Wear it on a chain around your neck for now," David suggested, removing the ring from the box. "Close to your heart. When the time is right, when I've sorted everything out with Emma, you can wear it properly." The sound of my own name spoken in this context felt surreal, as if I were watching a movie about someone else's life rather than witnessing the destruction of my own marriage. I leaned against the wall for support, my legs suddenly unsteady beneath me. Jessica took the ring, examining it in the light. "Are you sure about this? About leaving her? I don't want to be the woman who breaks up a marriage." "The marriage was over long before you came along," David replied with a conviction that stunned me. "Emma and I have been going through the motions for years. We're like roommates who happen to share a last name. There's no passion, no connection, no real partnership anymore. What you and I have is real, Jessica. It's what I should have been looking for all along." I pressed my hand to my mouth to prevent any sound from escaping. The casual dismissal of our 13-year marriage, as mere going through the motions, was devastating enough, but hearing David describe our relationship as devoid of passion and connection while standing there with another woman was almost unbearable. Jessica slipped the ring onto a chain she wore around her neck, tucking it beneath her blouse. "I love you," she whispered, reaching up to kiss David again. "I love you too," he replied, and the tenderness in his voice was unmistakable. It was the same tone he'd once used with me, in the early days of our relationship when everything felt possible and our future stretched before us like an endless adventure. I knew I needed to leave before they discovered me, but my feet seemed rooted to the spot. Part of me wanted to burst through the door and confront them both, to demand explanations and apologies and promises that could somehow undo what I'd witnessed. But a larger part of me recognized that confrontation in this moment would only create a scene that would humiliate me further while giving David the opportunity to control the narrative. Instead, I forced myself to step away from the door and continue down the hallway toward the main ballroom. My legs felt unsteady, and I was grateful for the wall to steady myself as I walked. The sounds of the party grew louder as I approached the ballroom, but they seemed to come from a great distance, as if I were hearing them through water. I found an empty chair at the edge of the dance floor and sat down carefully, my mind reeling with the implications of what I'd just witnessed. The conversations and laughter around me continued, as if nothing had changed, as if my entire world hadn't just shifted on its axis. I watched couples dancing to a slow jazz number, their faces content and trusting, and wondered how many of them were living similar lives. The practical part of my mind began cataloging details and asking questions. 8 months of an affair meant this wasn't a moment of weakness or a recent mistake in judgment. This was a sustained deception that had required planning, coordination, and countless small betrayals of our marriage vows. The promotion David had mentioned suggested this relationship wasn't just personal, but was potentially affecting his professional life as well. Most troubling was the ring, the symbol of commitment he'd just given to another woman, while still wearing the wedding band I'd placed on his finger 13 years ago. The calculated nature of that gesture, the planning it required, the level of emotional investment it represented, made it clear this wasn't a casual affair that might burn itself out naturally. David reappeared in the ballroom about 10 minutes later, his appearance restored to its earlier professional polish. He made his way over to where I sat, his expression pleasant and unremarkable. "Ready to head home?" he asked, checking his watch. "It's getting late, and I have an early meeting tomorrow." I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. As we collected our coats and made our goodbyes, I found myself studying David's face for signs of guilt or discomfort, but he maintained his usual social composure. He thanked the hosts, complimented the venue, and made small talk with colleagues as if he hadn't just promised another woman he would leave his wife. The drive home passed in relative silence. David commented on the party's success and mentioned a few work-related observations, but I contributed little to the conversation. I stared out the passenger window at the familiar streets of our neighborhood, wondering how many other secrets were hidden behind the cheerful holiday decorations and glowing windows. When we arrived home, David headed straight for his study to check emails, claiming he wanted to review some documents before his morning meeting. I went upstairs to our bedroom, where I sat on the edge of our bed still wearing the burgundy velvet dress, trying to process what I'd learned. The reflection in our dresser mirror showed a woman who looked exactly the same as she had 3 hours earlier, but who felt fundamentally different. The carefully applied makeup, the styled hair, the dress chosen to please a husband who was planning to leave her for someone else, all seemed like props in a performance I hadn't realized I was giving. I thought about Jessica's words about the difficulty of maintaining a charade, not realizing that I had been unwittingly participating in the same deception from the other side. While she struggled with the burden of keeping their relationship secret, I had been obliviously playing the role of the unsuspecting wife, making dinner reservations for anniversary celebrations that meant nothing to David, buying him thoughtful gifts while he was purchasing jewelry for another woman. The most painful realization was how thoroughly I had been excluded from the truth of my own life. While I had been attributing David's distance and distraction to work stress, while I had been making excuses for his absence and trying to be more understanding and supportive, he had been building an entirely separate life with someone else. Every late night at the office, every business trip, every canceled dinner had potentially been an opportunity for him to nurture this other relationship. I removed the dress carefully, hanging it back in the closet where it would likely remain unworn for months or years to come. As I changed into my pajamas and began removing my makeup, I caught sight of David's wedding ring on the nightstand, where he'd placed it before his shower. The platinum band sat there innocently, giving no indication of the duplicity it had witnessed. In the bathroom, I stared at my reflection in the harsh vanity lighting, seeing the fine lines around my eyes that seemed more pronounced tonight, the slight softness at my jaw that hadn't been there when David and I were newlyweds. At 39, I was no longer the young woman he'd married, though I'd never considered that a liability until this moment. Jessica's youth and vitality suddenly seemed less like natural advantages, and more like weapons deployed against our marriage. But even as I acknowledged the sting of being replaced by someone younger, I recognized that the problem ran deeper than simple age or attractiveness. David's words about our marriage being over long before Jessica arrived suggested a fundamental dissatisfaction that predated her presence in his life. The question was whether that dissatisfaction was based on real incompatibilities that had developed over time, or whether it was a convenient justification for pursuing someone new and exciting. I climbed into bed and lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of David moving around downstairs. The routine was familiar. He would spend another hour or two in his study, ostensibly working but possibly communicating with Jessica, before coming to bed and settling on his side without conversation or physical contact. We had been living like polite strangers for months, but now I understood that the distance hadn't been mutual at all. He had been actively withdrawing while I had been desperately trying to bridge the gap. When David finally came to bed, I pretended to be asleep, unwilling to engage in the kind of meaningless small talk that had characterized our recent interactions. He settled beside me with his back turned, and within minutes, his breathing had deepened into sleep. I envied him the peace of unconsciousness, while I lay awake, my mind churning with questions and possibilities. The immediate question was what to do with this new knowledge. I could confront David directly, demanding explanations and ultimatums, but that approach would likely result in denial, minimization, and counter-accusations designed to put me on the defensive. I could pretend I knew nothing, and attempt to salvage our marriage through counseling or increased effort on my part, but that would require ignoring the fundamental reality that David was emotionally and physically committed to someone else. Or I could take time to fully understand the scope of the deception, to gather information and develop a plan that protected my interests and gave me maximum leverage in whatever confrontation was inevitable. The strategic part of my mind, honed by years of managing complex design projects and difficult clients, began to assert itself over the emotional chaos. I thought about the practical implications of divorce. After 13 years of marriage, our house, purchased with both our incomes, but primarily paid for through David's salary increases and bonuses. Our joint savings accounts and retirement funds. The small inheritance I'd received from my grandmother that had been folded into our shared investments. The design business I'd built carefully over the past 5 years, which provided modest but steady income and could potentially be expanded if I had more time to devote to it. There was also the question of social consequences. David and I shared friends, professional networks, and social obligations that would be complicated by a divorce. Some people would inevitably take sides or make judgments about who was responsible for the marriage's failure. The prospect of having to explain and defend myself repeatedly was exhausting to contemplate. But perhaps most challenging was the simple fact that this life, this marriage, this partnership, had been my primary identity for 13 years. I was Emma Coleman, David's wife, the woman who hosted dinner parties and remembered everyone's anniversaries, who supported his career and maintained their home and served on the appropriate charitable committees. Without that role, I would need to rediscover who Emma was as an individual, what she wanted for her future, and how she wanted to spend the remaining decades of her life. As dawn began to creep through our bedroom windows, I finally fell into a fitful sleep, my last conscious thought being that tomorrow I would need to begin the careful process of protecting myself while gathering the information necessary to make informed decisions about my future. The woman who had dressed so carefully for last night's party was gone, replaced by someone who understood that survival sometimes required strategy rather than sentiment. The burgundy velvet dress, hanging in my closet, would serve as a reminder of the last night I'd lived in ignorance of my husband's betrayal. From now on, every decision would be made with full knowledge of where I stood in his priorities and what I needed to do to secure my own interests. I woke to the sound of David's alarm at 6:30, the same ringtone that had pulled me from sleep every weekday morning for the past 13 years. He moved through his morning routine with mechanical precision: shower, shave, coffee, scan the financial news on his phone while eating toast. I lay still in bed, watching him through half-closed eyes as he dressed for another day at Henderson and Associates, wondering how many mornings he'd performed this same ritual, while thinking about Jessica Martinez, instead of the life he was supposedly sharing with me. When David leaned over to kiss my forehead goodbye, a gesture that had once been automatic and loving, I had to resist the urge to turn away. His lips felt foreign against my skin, carrying the weight of deception I now knew existed behind every seemingly innocent interaction we'd had for the past 8 months. "Sleep well?" he asked, adjusting his tie in the dresser mirror. There was something different in his tone this morning, a lightness that hadn't been there in months. Of course there was. He'd given another woman a ring last night and made promises about their future together. He was probably feeling relieved to have taken that step, to have made his intentions clear to Jessica, even if he hadn't yet found the courage to be honest with me. "Fine," I managed, my voice still thick with sleep and the emotional exhaustion of the previous evening. "You have that early meeting, right? Morrison Industries," he confirmed, checking his watch. "Big presentation today. If it goes well, we might finally close the deal." I nodded, making appropriate noises of support and encouragement, while my mind catalogued this information differently than I would have 24 hours ago. Was the Morrison meeting real, or was it cover for spending time with Jessica? Had their affair already progressed to the point where they were coordinating their schedules to maximize their time together? How many of David's supposed work obligations had been fabrications designed to allow him to pursue his relationship with her? After David left, I remained in bed for another hour, staring at the ceiling and allowing myself to fully absorb the reality of my situation. The woman who had carefully selected a dress to please her husband the night before no longer existed. In her place was someone who needed to understand exactly what she was dealing with and what options were available to her. I made coffee and settled at the kitchen table with my laptop, ostensibly to review client emails for my design business, but actually to begin the careful process of gathering information. My first stop was Henderson and Associates' website, where I searched for Jessica Martinez's professional profile. Her bio listed impressive credentials: MBA from Northwestern, previous experience at 2 well-regarded Chicago marketing firms, specialized expertise in digital strategy and client relationship management. The photograph showed the same confident young woman I'd watched David kiss less than 12 hours earlier. The timeline of her employment confirmed what I'd overheard. Jessica had joined Henderson and Associates in April, exactly 8 months ago. I cross-referenced this with my own memories of when David's behavior had begun to change, when he'd started working later and becoming more distant at home. The correlation was undeniable. I spent the next several hours conducting what I privately termed reconnaissance, using the investigative skills I'd developed through years of researching suppliers, contractors, and vendors for my design projects. David's social media presence was minimal and carefully curated, showing only professional achievements and the occasional photo of us at social events. But Jessica's Instagram account, though set to private, had a public profile picture that showed her wearing a delicate gold chain, similar to the one I'd seen her use to hide David's ring. The rational part of my mind recognized I was walking a dangerous line between gathering necessary information and becoming obsessed with details that might not serve my ultimate interests. But I couldn't seem to stop myself from searching for evidence of their relationship, for clues about how long this had been developing and how serious it had become. My phone rang around 10:30, interrupting my research. The caller ID showed my sister Rachel's name, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. Rachel had an uncanny ability to detect when something was wrong in my life, even through a phone conversation, and I wasn't ready to discuss what I'd discovered with anyone yet. "Hey, Rachel said when I answered, her voice bright with its usual morning energy. How was the Christmas party last night? Did you wear that gorgeous burgundy dress you showed me? I did, I replied, trying to inject some enthusiasm into my voice. It was a nice evening. David got some recognition for his work on several major accounts. That's wonderful. And how are things with you two generally? You've seemed a bit stressed the last few times we've talked. Rachel's concern was genuine, but her timing was terrible. She was the one person in my life who knew me well enough to see through whatever facade I might attempt, but she was also someone whose immediate reaction would be to encourage confrontation and dramatic action. I needed time to think and plan before involving anyone else in this situation. We're fine, I said, hating the lie but recognizing its necessity. Just the usual work pressures and holiday stress, you know how it is. We talked for another few minutes about her own holiday plans and our parents' upcoming visit, but I found it difficult to concentrate on the conversation. Everything felt different now that I knew the truth about David's activities. Even casual discussions about family gatherings and holiday traditions seemed loaded with new meaning, reminders of the life I'd thought we were building together, but which apparently existed primarily in my imagination. After ending the call with Rachel, I made myself a sandwich I didn't want and tried to focus on actual work responsibilities. I had 3 active projects that needed attention: a boutique hotel renovation in the Arts District, a private residence in the suburbs that required complete color and furniture coordination, and a small office space for a startup company that was operating on a tight budget but had interesting design potential. Normally, these projects would have engaged my full attention.
I took pride in my work and had built a solid reputation over the past 5 years for delivering creative solutions that met both aesthetic and practical requirements. But today I found myself reading the same email 3 times without absorbing its content, staring at fabric samples without seeing their colors, and sketching room layouts that bore no relationship to the actual spaces I was supposed to be designing. The boutique hotel project, in particular, felt overwhelming in light of my current circumstances. The owners were a young couple who had invested their life savings in pursuing their dream of creating a unique hospitality experience. Their enthusiasm and commitment to their shared vision reminded me painfully of the early years of my marriage, when David and I had made similar plans and promises about building something meaningful together. I closed my laptop and walked through our house, seeing it with new eyes. David and I had purchased this Tudor-style home in Riverside Heights 7 years ago, choosing it for its character and potential rather than its immediate perfection. We'd spent weekends visiting antique shops and estate sales, searching for pieces that would complement the house's architectural details. We'd painted rooms together, debated furniture placement, and gradually created a space that reflected both our tastes and our shared commitment to creating a beautiful home. Now every carefully chosen element seemed to mock me. The dining room table we'd found at an estate sale in Connecticut, where we'd imagined hosting dinner parties and holiday celebrations for decades to come. The living room sofa we'd saved for months to afford, selected for both its classic lines and its comfort during long evenings of reading and conversation. The kitchen renovation we'd completed 3 years ago, designed around the assumption that we would cook and entertain together for the foreseeable future. Most painful was our bedroom, where David's presence still lingered in the rumpled sheets and the scent of his cologne on the pillows. The king-size bed we'd chosen together now felt enormous and empty, a physical reminder of the emotional distance that had been growing between us for months. I wondered how many nights David had lain beside me thinking about Jessica, counting the hours until he could see her again. I spent the afternoon organizing my office, a task that required enough concentration to temporarily distract me from the chaos in my personal life. I filed client contracts, updated project timelines, and reconciled expenses from recent purchases. The familiar routine of administrative tasks provided a sense of control and accomplishment that I desperately needed. As I worked, I found myself thinking about the practical implications of my discovery. If David was planning to leave our marriage for Jessica, I needed to understand exactly what that would mean financially. We owned our house jointly, though David's income had contributed more significantly to the mortgage payments and property improvements. Our savings and investment accounts were also joint, accumulated primarily through his salary and bonuses, though supplemented by my business income. More concerning was the question of whether David had already begun moving assets or making financial preparations for a separation.
The ring he'd given Jessica represented a significant expense, but I had no way of knowing whether he'd purchased it with our joint funds or through some separate account I wasn't aware of. If he was as strategic as I suspected, he might already be working with an attorney or financial advisor to protect his interests in an eventual divorce. The thought of consulting a divorce attorney myself seemed premature, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to better understand my rights and options. I'd never been in a position where I couldn't trust David's honesty about our financial situation, but clearly my assumptions about his trustworthiness had been fundamentally flawed in other areas. David returned home around 7:30, later than usual but not uncommonly so, given his recent pattern of extended workdays. He seemed pleased and energetic, greeting me with more warmth than he'd shown in weeks. The presentation had gone well, he reported, and Morrison Industries was moving forward with hiring Henderson and Associates for their upcoming campaign. This could be the breakthrough we've been working toward, he said, loosening his tie and pouring himself a scotch from the bar cart in our living room. The commission alone would represent about 30% of my annual income, not counting the potential for follow-up projects. I made appropriate congratulatory noises while internally noting the significance of this development. A major professional success would presumably strengthen David's position at the firm and increase his earning potential. If he was planning to leave our marriage, this kind of career advancement would work in his favor both financially and in terms of his ability to support two households. We should celebrate, I suggested, testing his reaction. Maybe dinner at that new restaurant downtown you mentioned wanting to try? David hesitated, and I saw something flicker across his expression before he recovered his composure. Actually, I promised to take the team out for drinks to celebrate. You know how it is with these big wins, everyone wants to decompress together and talk about the strategy for implementation. The explanation was plausible, the kind of professional obligation that had become routine over the past months. But now I heard it differently, understanding that the team likely included Jessica and that drinks might extend into the evening in ways that had nothing to do with professional celebration. Of course, I replied. Will you be very late? Probably not before 11, David said, avoiding my eyes as he headed upstairs to change clothes. Don't wait up. I watched him go, noting the spring in his step that suggested he was looking forward to the evening ahead. While he showered and dressed, I prepared a simple dinner for myself and tried to imagine how this same scene might have played out if I hadn't witnessed their interaction the night before. I would have been disappointed but understanding, probably spending the evening working on client projects or reading in bed, never suspecting that my husband's professional obligations were cover for continuing his relationship with another woman. David left around 8:15, kissing my cheek in the same perfunctory way he had for months, and I settled in to spend the evening alone with my thoughts and my growing understanding of the deception that had been shaping our lives. I poured myself a glass of wine and returned to my laptop, this time focusing on research that felt more urgent. I looked up divorce attorneys in our city, reading reviews and examining their areas of specialization. I investigated the process for protecting assets during separation proceedings. I researched the typical timeline for divorce in our state and the factors that courts considered when dividing marital property. The information was both reassuring and overwhelming. Our state had no-fault divorce laws, which meant I wouldn't need to prove David's adultery to obtain a dissolution of our marriage. Property division would be based on principles of equitable distribution rather than simple 50-50 splits, taking into account factors like the length of the marriage, each spouse's earning capacity, and contributions to the household, both financial and otherwise. What concerned me was the question of spousal support. David's income was substantially higher than mine, and while my business was growing steadily, it couldn't yet support the lifestyle we'd built together. If David left me for Jessica, I would likely need to sell our house and significantly downsize my living situation unless I could negotiate adequate support payments. The more I learned, the more I realized how vulnerable my position was. For 13 years, I'd trusted David to handle most of our financial planning and major decisions. I knew the general outlines of our economic situation, but lacked detailed knowledge of our investments, retirement accounts, and long-term financial strategies. This lack of involvement, which had seemed reasonable when our marriage felt secure, now appeared to be a significant disadvantage. I spent several hours creating spreadsheets that detailed our assets, debts, and monthly expenses as best I could determine them. The exercise was both sobering and empowering. While I couldn't access all the information I needed without David's involvement, I could at least begin to understand the scope of what would need to be addressed in any separation proceedings. Around 11:30, I heard David's car in the driveway. I quickly closed my laptop and headed upstairs, not wanting to be caught researching divorce proceedings when he came inside. I was brushing my teeth when he entered the bathroom, his hair slightly mussed and his shirt wrinkled in ways that suggested more than casual business drinks. "How was the celebration?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral and interested. "Good," he replied, avoiding eye contact as he began his own bedtime routine. Everyone was excited about the opportunities this could create for the firm. I studied his reflection in the bathroom mirror, looking for signs of guilt or discomfort, but David had apparently perfected the art of compartmentalization. He seemed relaxed and satisfied, as if the evening had gone exactly as he'd hoped. "Did Jessica enjoy the celebration too?" I asked casually, testing whether the direct mention of her name would provoke any reaction. David paused for just a moment before responding. "I think so. She worked on several components of the presentation, so she deserved to be part of the recognition." The careful neutrality of his response told me everything I needed to know. A man who was simply proud of a colleague's professional contributions would have spoken more enthusiastically about her role in their success. David's measured tone suggested someone who was being deliberately cautious about expressing too much interest in Jessica's satisfaction or well-being. We finished our bedtime routines in relative silence and climbed into bed on our respective sides. David seemed to fall asleep quickly, but I lay awake for hours, my mind churning with questions and possibilities. Tomorrow, I decided I would begin taking more concrete steps to protect myself and gather the information I needed to make informed decisions about my future. The first priority would be securing my own financial resources and understanding exactly what David had access to in our joint accounts. The second would be finding a way to confirm the extent of his relationship with Jessica and whether they had made any specific plans for their future together. The third would be consulting with a divorce attorney to understand my rights and options, even if I wasn't yet ready to file for separation. As dawn approached, I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, my last conscious thought being that the comfortable predictability of my marriage had been replaced by the exhausting uncertainty of not knowing what new deceptions each day might reveal. The woman who had trusted her husband completely was gone, replaced by someone who understood that survival might require strategic thinking rather than continued faith in David's honesty or commitment to our marriage. The next morning brought a cold December rain that matched my mood perfectly. David left for work at his usual time, mentioning a full day of meetings related to the Morrison account implementation. I waited until I was certain he was gone before beginning what I privately thought of as my investigation. My first call was to our bank, where I spoke with the personal banker who had handled our accounts for the past 5 years. Under the guise of wanting to be more involved in our financial planning, I requested detailed statements for all our accounts going back 12 months. The banker was happy to accommodate what seemed like a reasonable request from a joint account holder who wanted to take a more active role in managing their family's finances. The statements revealed patterns that would have been invisible to me if I hadn't known what to look for. There were regular cash withdrawals that didn't correspond to any household expenses I could identify. There were credit card charges at restaurants I'd never heard of, hotels in nearby cities that didn't align with any business travel David had mentioned, and purchases from jewelry stores and boutiques that hadn't resulted in gifts for me. Most concerning were several large transfers to a checking account I didn't recognize. The amounts were significant enough to require David's active authorization, but small enough to avoid triggering any automatic notifications that might have alerted me to their existence. It appeared that David had been systematically moving money from our joint accounts to this separate account for the past 6 months. Armed with the account number from the bank statements, I was able to determine that David had opened the account at a different bank across town. I couldn't access the details of how those funds were being used without David's authorization, but the very existence of a secret account confirmed that his deception extended far beyond his relationship with Jessica. My next call was to our insurance agent, again under the pretense of wanting to review our coverage and ensure we had adequate protection. I learned that David had recently increased his life insurance policy and changed the beneficiary designation, though the agent couldn't provide specific details without David's written consent.
The timing of these changes, however, aligned with the beginning of his relationship with Jessica. The picture that emerged from these inquiries was of a man who had been systematically preparing for a major life change while maintaining the facade of a committed marriage. The hidden account, the insurance changes, the careful management of expenses related to his affair, all suggested a level of planning and premeditation that made his deception feel even more calculated and hurtful. I spent the afternoon creating detailed documentation of everything I'd discovered, organizing bank statements and insurance information in a way that would be useful if I needed to present evidence of David's financial misconduct. The process was emotionally exhausting but also oddly empowering. For the first time since discovering his affair, I felt like I was taking concrete steps to protect my interests rather than simply reacting to his betrayal. Around 4 o'clock, I received a text message from David saying he would be working late again and not to expect him for dinner. The message included no explanation of what urgent work required his attention or when he might be home. 6 months ago, I would have accepted this at face value and probably offered to bring him dinner at the office. Now I understood it was likely code for another evening with Jessica. Instead of sitting home alone wondering what they were doing together, I decided to take a more proactive approach. I drove to the Henderson and Associates office building, parking where I could observe the main entrance without being easily noticed. I felt slightly ridiculous conducting surveillance on my own husband, but I needed to know whether his claims about working late were legitimate or whether he was meeting Jessica elsewhere. David's car was indeed in the parking garage, but I also spotted Jessica's silver Honda in a space 2 levels up. At 6:30, I watched them leave the building together, walking closely but not touching in the public space. They got into David's car and drove away, leaving Jessica's vehicle in the garage. The implication was clear: they were planning to spend the evening together and would return later for her to retrieve her car. I followed at a distance, my heart pounding with nervousness and the surreal quality of spying on my own husband. They drove to a small Italian restaurant in a neighborhood across town, the kind of intimate place with dim lighting and private booths that would be perfect for a romantic dinner. I parked where I could see the entrance and watched them go inside, David's hand resting protectively on Jessica's lower back in a gesture that spoke of established intimacy and comfort. Sitting in my car outside the restaurant where my husband was having dinner with his mistress felt like the lowest point of this entire experience. The woman who had prided herself on the trust and communication in her marriage was reduced to conducting surveillance because she could no longer believe anything David told her. Yet I couldn't bring myself to leave without confirming that my suspicions were accurate. They stayed in the restaurant for nearly 2 hours, emerging around 9 o'clock with the relaxed body language of people who had enjoyed each other's company without the tension of deception or time pressure. David helped Jessica into his car with the kind of solicitous attention he'd once shown me, and they drove away into the night, presumably to continue their evening somewhere more private. I drove home through the December rain, feeling both vindicated and devastated by what I'd witnessed. The elaborate fiction of David's work obligations had been definitively exposed, but knowing the truth didn't lessen the pain of seeing him treat another woman with the care and attention that had once been exclusively mine. Back in our empty house, I poured myself another glass of wine and settled in my home office to continue documenting what I'd learned. The evidence was mounting that David's relationship with Jessica was far more serious than a simple affair. The ring, the financial preparations, the careful orchestration of their time together, all pointed to a man who was planning a future with someone other than his wife. The question that remained was whether to confront David directly with what I'd discovered or to continue gathering information until I had a complete picture of his plans and intentions. Confrontation would provide immediate satisfaction and potentially force him to end his relationship with Jessica, but it would also alert him to my awareness and give him the opportunity to conceal or transfer assets before I could protect my interests. Continued surveillance felt degrading and exhausting, but it might be necessary to ensure I understood the full scope of his deception before taking any irreversible steps. The strategic part of my mind recognized that knowledge was power in this situation, and premature action could put me at a significant disadvantage in any eventual separation proceedings. As I sat in my office surrounded by bank statements and legal research, I realized that the comfortable certainties of my married life had been replaced by a complex game of strategy and deception. I was no longer Emma Coleman, the trusting wife who assumed her husband's honesty and good intentions. I was becoming someone harder and more calculating, someone who understood that protecting herself might require tactics she'd never imagined needing. The transformation was necessary but painful. Every decision now required careful consideration of David's potential reactions and countermoves. Every conversation would be evaluated for hidden meanings and deliberate omissions. Every aspect of our shared life would be examined for evidence of his plans and preparations. Tomorrow, I decided, I would make an appointment with a divorce attorney, even if I wasn't yet ready to file for separation. I needed professional guidance about how to protect my interests, while continuing to gather information about David's activities. I also needed to understand what legal requirements existed for dividing our assets, and whether David's secret account and insurance changes would affect those calculations. The woman who had dressed so carefully for the Christmas party just 2 nights ago felt like a stranger now.
In her place was someone who understood that sometimes the greatest act of self-preservation was recognizing when the life you'd built was based on lies and having the courage to build something better, even if it meant starting over completely. I finished my wine and headed upstairs to bed, knowing that David wouldn't return until after midnight and that I would pretend to be asleep when he finally came home. The performance of our marriage would continue for now, but only until I was ready to end it on my own terms with full knowledge of what I was entitled to and what I needed to do to secure my future. The rain continued through the night, washing away the last remnants of the woman who had believed in the fairy tale of her perfect marriage and preparing the ground for whatever would grow in its place. The law office of Margaret Chen and Associates occupied the 15th floor of a sleek downtown building, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city that had been my home for the past 15 years. I sat in the elegant waiting area, my hands folded in my lap, trying to project an image of calm competence while my stomach churned with nervous energy. This was my first appointment with a divorce attorney, a step that felt both necessary and surreal given that 3 days ago I'd still believed my marriage was simply going through a rough patch. Margaret Chen emerged from her office precisely at our scheduled time, a woman in her late 40s with an air of professional authority that immediately put me at ease. Her handshake was firm, her smile warm but businesslike, and her manner suggested someone who had guided many other women through similar crises with skill and discretion. "Mrs. Coleman," she said, leading me into her office, "I understand you're here to discuss some concerns about your marriage. Why don't you tell me what's brought you to see me today?" Her office was decorated in soothing neutrals with touches of sophisticated artwork that spoke to both success and good taste. I settled into a comfortable leather chair across from her mahogany desk and took a steadying breath before beginning the story that had upended my world. I told Margaret about the Christmas party, about witnessing David give Jessica the ring, about the financial irregularities I'd discovered, and about my growing understanding that their relationship was far more serious than a casual affair. I presented the bank statements I'd organized and the documentation of David's suspicious activities, watching Margaret's expression grow more focused as she absorbed the details. "How long do you estimate this relationship has been ongoing?" Margaret asked, making notes on a legal pad as I spoke. 8 months, based on what I overheard them saying. It coincides with when Jessica joined David's firm, and when his behavior toward me began to change significantly. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "And you mentioned he's opened a separate account that you weren't aware of. Do you have any estimate of how much money he's transferred there?" I consulted my notes, grateful that I'd taken the time to organize this information before the meeting. "Approximately $37,000 over the past 6 months based on the transfers I could identify from our joint accounts. There may be additional funds from sources I don't have access to. That's substantial," Margaret observed. "It suggests a level of planning that goes beyond simple marital dissatisfaction. Tell me about your own financial situation. Do you have independent income and assets?" I explained my design business, its current earnings and growth potential, and my limited personal savings that weren't commingled with our joint accounts. Margaret listened carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions about the duration of our marriage, whether we had children, and the extent of our shared property. "Your situation is more common than you might think," Margaret said when I'd finished my summary. "Successful professional men often begin preparing for divorce months or even years before their wives become aware there's a problem. The good news is that you've discovered this relatively early in the process, which gives us options for protecting your interests." She outlined the basic principles of divorce law in our state, explaining how marital property would be divided and what factors the court would consider in determining spousal support. The hidden account would definitely be considered marital property, regardless of David's attempts to keep it separate, and his affair could potentially affect the court's assessment of his credibility in other matters. What I'd recommend, Margaret continued, is that we take some immediate steps to protect your position while you decide how you want to proceed. We can petition the court to freeze all marital assets, preventing David from transferring additional funds or making major financial decisions without your knowledge. We can also arrange for a forensic accounting review to determine whether there are other hidden assets or financial activities you haven't discovered yet. The prospect of formal legal action felt overwhelming, even though I understood its necessity. How quickly would David become aware that I've taken these steps? I asked. He would be notified of any court filings within a few days, Margaret replied. Once we petition to freeze assets, the element of surprise would be lost. Is there additional information you need to gather before we move forward? I thought about the questions that were still keeping me awake at night. How serious were David's plans with Jessica? Had they set a timeline for him leaving our marriage? Were there other financial preparations he'd made that I hadn't discovered? How much of our social and professional circle was already aware of their relationship? I think I need a little more time to understand the full scope of the situation, I told Margaret. But I want to be prepared to act quickly when I'm ready. Margaret nodded approvingly. That's wise. Gather whatever additional information you can, but don't put yourself at risk by taking actions that might alert David to your suspicions. In the meantime, I'd recommend opening your own individual bank account and beginning to transfer some funds there for your immediate security. Nothing so substantial that it would be noticed immediately, but enough to ensure you have access to money if the situation escalates quickly. She provided me with a list of documents to gather and steps to take to protect my interests while maintaining the appearance of normalcy in my marriage. As I prepared to leave, Margaret offered one final piece of advice that stayed with me long after our meeting ended. Remember that you're not responsible for fixing David's choices or managing his emotions when the truth comes out, she said. Your job is to protect yourself and secure your future. Don't let guilt or sympathy prevent you from taking the steps necessary to ensure you're treated fairly. I left Margaret's office feeling both empowered and overwhelmed by the magnitude of what lay ahead. The legal framework for divorce was clearer now, but the emotional and practical challenges of dismantling a 13-year marriage still felt daunting. I drove home through the afternoon traffic, my mind churning with Margaret's advice and the steps I needed to take next. That evening, David returned home with an elaborate bouquet of flowers and a bottle of expensive wine, claiming he wanted to celebrate the Morrison Industries' success properly with me since he'd been so busy with work obligations the past few days. The timing of this romantic gesture wasn't lost on me. After spending the previous evening with Jessica, he was apparently trying to assuage whatever guilt he might be feeling about his deception. These are beautiful, I said, accepting the flowers with what I hoped appeared to be genuine appreciation. You didn't need to do this. I wanted to, David replied, pulling me into an embrace that felt strange and artificial given what I now knew about how he was spending his free time. I know I've been distracted lately, and I don't want you to think I don't appreciate everything you do to support my career. The irony of his words was almost painful. While he spoke of appreciation and support, he was actively planning to leave our marriage for someone else. The flowers and wine were likely motivated more by guilt than genuine affection, a way of maintaining the facade while he continued his relationship with Jessica. We had dinner together for the first time in weeks, and David made an obvious effort to be attentive and engaged. He asked about my current design projects, complimented my cooking, and suggested we plan a weekend getaway after the holidays. Under normal circumstances, this kind of attention would have pleased me and felt like progress in our relationship. Now it seemed like performance art, a carefully orchestrated attempt to throw me off the scent of his real activities. I was thinking we might go back to that bed and breakfast in Vermont, David suggested as we finished our meal. Remember how much we enjoyed it for our anniversary 2 years ago? I remembered the trip well. We'd spent a long weekend hiking mountain trails, browsing antique shops, and reconnecting after a particularly stressful period in David's career. It had felt like a return to the early days of our relationship, when we'd been genuinely happy and optimistic about our future together. That sounds lovely, I replied, knowing that any such trip would likely be canceled due to David's work obligations or postponed indefinitely while he figured out how to extricate himself from our marriage. When were you thinking? Maybe late January, after things settled down with the Morrison implementation, David said. I want to make sure I can focus completely on us without any work distractions. The conversation continued in this vein for another hour, with David painting pictures of a future together that I now understood he had no intention of pursuing. It was simultaneously heartbreaking and infuriating to watch him perform the role of devoted husband while knowing that his real emotional investment was elsewhere. After dinner, we settled in the living room with our wine, and David surprised me by suggesting we watch a movie together, something we hadn't done in months. He selected a romantic comedy from our streaming service, settling beside me on the sofa with his arm around my shoulders in a gesture that once would have felt natural and comforting. As we watched the film, I found myself studying David's profile, searching for signs of the man I'd fallen in love with 13 years ago. He was still handsome, still successful, still capable of charm and attentiveness when he chose to deploy it. But there was something different about him now, a quality of distance even in moments of apparent intimacy, as if part of his mind was always elsewhere. I thought about Jessica, probably at home in her apartment, perhaps wearing the ring David had given her on the chain around her neck. Was she counting the days until David worked up the courage to leave his marriage? Was she growing impatient with the secrecy and deception, as her words at the Christmas party had suggested? How long could they maintain this elaborate charade before something forced a resolution? The movie ended, and David suggested we go to bed together, his hand trailing along my arm in a way that clearly indicated his intentions. The prospect of physical intimacy with him while knowing about his relationship with Jessica was deeply disturbing, but I also recognized that any sudden change in our routine might alert him to my suspicions. I managed to deflect his advances without creating obvious tension, claiming fatigue and suggesting we both get a good night's sleep before the busy day ahead. David seemed slightly disappointed but not suspicious, kissing me goodnight with what appeared to be genuine affection before settling on his side of the bed. As I lay awake listening to David's breathing deepen into sleep, I reflected on the surreal quality of the evening. The flowers, the wine, the romantic dinner, the movie, all felt like elaborate props in a play where only one actor knew the true plot. David's performance had been convincing, but I could no longer unsee the truth behind it. The next morning brought a text message that would change everything. I was having coffee and reviewing client emails when my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. The content was brief but devastating. I thought you should know what your husband is really doing. Check his social media messages if you want proof. My hands trembled as I stared at the message, wondering who had sent it and what additional evidence they might possess. The logical part of my mind warned that this could be a malicious prank or an attempt to create drama where none existed, but my instincts told me this was someone with genuine knowledge of David's activities. I spent the next hour trying to access David's social media accounts, most of which were password protected in ways I couldn't easily circumvent. However, his laptop was open in his study, where he'd apparently been working late the night before, and I was able to access his Facebook messages before the screen locked automatically. What I found there exceeded even my worst suspicions. Months of intimate conversations between David and Jessica, planning their future together with the casual assumption that his marriage to me was simply an obstacle to be navigated rather than a meaningful commitment to be honored. They discussed apartments they might rent together, vacation destinations they wanted to visit, and the timeline for David's separation from me. Most painful were the messages where David described his feelings about our marriage in terms that bore no resemblance to the life I thought we'd been sharing. He characterized me as emotionally needy and professionally unfocused, someone who had become more of a burden than a partner. He described our intimate moments with clinical detachment, as performances he endured rather than experiences he valued. Jessica's responses were equally revealing. She clearly viewed me as an impediment to her happiness, rather than a real person deserving of consideration or respect.
Her messages contained casual cruelties about my appearance, my career, and my intelligence that suggested David had been sharing private information about our marriage in ways that betrayed every principle of loyalty and discretion. The timeline revealed in their messages confirmed that their relationship had indeed begun 8 months ago, but it had escalated much more quickly than I'd realized. They were already discussing moving in together, and had apparently agreed that David would file for divorce by March, giving him time to prepare Emma for the transition and minimize the financial complications. I printed the most damaging messages before David's laptop automatically locked, my hands shaking as I fed page after page into our home printer. The evidence was devastating, but it was also exactly what Margaret Chen would need to build a strong case for protecting my interests in any divorce proceedings. The anonymous text message had been a gift, though I couldn't fathom who might have sent it or why they'd chosen to intervene in my situation. Perhaps it was someone from David's office who felt guilty about witnessing his deception, or maybe it was one of Jessica's friends who disapproved of their relationship. The identity of my informant mattered less than the fact that I now had documentary evidence of David's plans and his casual betrayal of our marriage vows. I spent the remainder of the morning organizing this new evidence and adding it to the file I'd been building since discovering their affair. The picture that emerged was of a calculated campaign to end our marriage on David's terms, while minimizing his financial exposure and preserving his professional reputation. He hadn't simply fallen in love with someone else, he had systematically planned to replace me while ensuring I remained unaware until he was ready to execute his strategy. Around noon, I received a call from David saying he'd be working through lunch and might be late getting home again that evening. The Morrison project required additional attention, he explained, and the entire team was putting in extra hours to ensure successful implementation. I made appropriate supportive noises while mentally noting that the entire team undoubtedly included Jessica, and that their work session would likely extend well into the evening. Instead of spending another evening alone wondering what they were doing together, I decided to take more direct action. I called Margaret Chen's office and scheduled an emergency appointment for later that afternoon. The new evidence I'd discovered changed the urgency of my situation significantly. David's timeline for filing divorce papers in March meant I had less than 3 months to protect my interests and prepare for the legal battle ahead. Margaret was available at 4 o'clock, and I arrived at her office with a thick folder containing all the evidence I'd gathered over the past week. She reviewed the Facebook messages with growing amazement, occasionally shaking her head at the casual cruelty of David's characterizations of our marriage. "This is quite remarkable," Margaret said when she'd finished reading. "It's unusual for someone to document their intentions so thoroughly, but it gives us significant leverage in negotiations." David's characterization of the marriage as emotionally defunct, combined with the evidence of financial planning for separation, suggests a pattern of deliberate deception that any judge would find troubling. She explained how the messages could be used to support claims of emotional distress and financial misconduct, potentially affecting both the division of assets and any spousal support arrangements. The fact that David had been planning his departure for months while maintaining the pretense of working on our marriage would definitely influence how a court viewed his credibility and good faith. "I think it's time to take protective action," Margaret advised. "David's timeline suggests he's planning to blindside you with divorce papers in a few months, probably after he's completed additional financial preparations you're not aware of. We need to get ahead of that timeline and ensure you're protected before he takes any irreversible steps." We discussed the specific actions Margaret would take, filing a petition to freeze all marital assets, requesting a complete financial disclosure from David, and beginning the process of forensic accounting to identify any additional hidden assets or financial misconduct. The formal legal process would begin within the week, which meant David would be served with papers that would alert him to my knowledge of his plans. "How do you think he'll react when he realizes you know about the affair and his preparations?"
Margaret asked. I considered this carefully, drawing on 13 years of experience with David's personality and his typical responses to being caught in uncomfortable situations. He'll be angry at first, probably trying to blame me for snooping or violating his privacy. Then he'll try to minimize the significance of what I've discovered, claiming the relationship with Jessica isn't serious or that the messages don't mean what they clearly say. Finally, he'll probably try to negotiate from a position of supposed strength, offering me a settlement that appears generous but actually protects his most important assets. Margaret nodded approvingly. That's a very astute assessment. Knowing his likely tactics will help us prepare our responses and ensure we don't get drawn into emotional arguments that distract from the legal issues at stake. I left Margaret's office feeling more prepared for the confrontation ahead, but also deeply sad about the finality of the steps I was taking. Once David was served with legal papers, any possibility of saving our marriage would be definitively ended. While I understood that the marriage was already over in every meaningful sense, taking formal legal action felt like acknowledging the death of dreams and plans that had sustained me for more than a decade. The drive home took me past the restaurant where I'd watched David and Jessica have dinner just days earlier. The intimate little Italian place looked charming and romantic in the late afternoon light, the kind of spot where couples celebrated anniversaries and special occasions. I wondered how many other women had driven past that same restaurant not knowing their husbands were inside with other women, living out fantasies of different lives while their wives waited at home. David's car was in our driveway when I arrived, which surprised me given his earlier message about working late. I found him in the kitchen, preparing what appeared to be an elaborate dinner with ingredients I didn't recognize from our usual grocery shopping. "You're home early," I observed, setting my purse on the counter and trying to read his expression. "I wanted to surprise you," David replied, stirring something that smelled like a complex sauce. "I thought we could have a quiet evening together, just the two of us. I picked up some of those lamb chops you like from that specialty butcher downtown." The gesture was thoughtful and would have been touching under different circumstances, but knowing what I now knew about his plans and his private communications with Jessica, it felt like another performance designed to maintain his deception. I wondered if he was feeling guilty about something specific that had happened with Jessica, or if this was part of a broader strategy to keep me content and unsuspecting while he finalized his preparations for leaving. "That's very sweet of you," I said, accepting a glass of wine he offered. "What's the occasion?" "No occasion," David replied, though something in his expression suggested otherwise. "I just realized how little time we've been spending together lately, and I wanted to make an effort to change that." We cooked together in a companionable way that reminded me of the early years of our marriage, when such collaboration had been natural and frequent. David was an excellent cook when he chose to apply himself, and he seemed genuinely focused on creating a special evening for us. If I hadn't read his messages to Jessica that morning, I might have been hopeful that this represented a genuine turn in our relationship. Over dinner, David was more attentive and emotionally present than he'd been in months. He asked thoughtful questions about my work, shared amusing stories from his office, and seemed genuinely interested in my opinions and responses. The contrast with his recent distant behavior was striking, but rather than feeling encouraged, I found myself analyzing his performance and wondering what had motivated this sudden change. "I've been thinking about what you said the other night about us not spending enough time together," David said as we finished our meal. "I want you to know that you're still the most important person in my life, Emma. Whatever problems we've had, whatever distance has developed between us, I want to work on fixing that." The sincerity in his voice was compelling, but I knew it was built on a foundation of lies that made any genuine reconciliation impossible. David was either compartmentalizing his relationship with Jessica to an extraordinary degree, or he was deliberately manipulating my emotions to serve some agenda I couldn't yet understand. "I appreciate that," I replied carefully. "I want us to be happy together too." We spent the evening talking about our early relationship, sharing memories of trips we'd taken and milestones we'd celebrated together. David seemed nostalgic and genuinely affectionate, touching my hand across the table and looking at me with something that resembled the warmth he'd shown during our courtship years. When we went to bed, David pulled me close to him in a way he hadn't done in months, holding me against his chest while we talked quietly about our hopes for the future. His touch felt familiar and comforting, and for brief moments I could almost forget what I'd learned about his secret life with Jessica. But even as I allowed myself to enjoy this temporary return to intimacy, I couldn't shake the knowledge that it was built on deception. The man holding me had spent months planning to leave our marriage while maintaining elaborate pretenses about his commitment to our future together. The tenderness he was showing tonight would likely evaporate as soon as he was served with legal papers that revealed my awareness of his plans.
I fell asleep in David's arms for the first time in months, but my dreams were troubled by images of locked doors and hidden keys, of rings given to other women and promises that disappeared like smoke in the morning light. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of formal legal proceedings that would transform our marriage from a private struggle into a public battle, with attorneys and judges determining the value of 13 years of shared life. The woman who had trusted her husband's love and loyalty was finally definitively gone. In her place was someone who understood that survival sometimes required accepting painful truths and taking decisive action to protect what could still be saved from the wreckage of misplaced faith. The knock at the door came at exactly 3:15 on Tuesday afternoon, just as Margaret Chen had predicted. I watched through our front window as a professional process server stood on our porch, holding the manila envelope that would officially notify David of the asset freeze petition and financial disclosure requirements we'd filed with the court. My hands trembled slightly as I signed for the certified mail delivery that would be forwarded to David's office, marking the moment when my private investigation transformed into formal legal action. I spent the remainder of the afternoon preparing for David's reaction, which I expected would be swift and intense once he received the papers. Margaret had warned me that men like David often responded to being caught with a combination of rage, denial, and attempts at manipulation designed to regain control of the narrative. She'd advised me to remain calm, stick to factual responses, and avoid being drawn into emotional arguments that might compromise my position. David's Mercedes pulled into our driveway at 4:45, much earlier than his usual arrival time, and suggesting he'd left work immediately after being served. I positioned myself in the living room where I could see his approach, noting the rigid set of his shoulders and the aggressive way he slammed his car door. The charming, attentive husband from the previous evening had vanished, replaced by someone who looked capable of considerable fury. He entered through the front door without his usual greeting, his face flushed and his jaw clenched in barely controlled anger. The legal papers were crumpled in his right hand, and his eyes had a wild quality I'd never seen before in our 13 years together. For a moment I felt genuinely afraid of what he might do or say. "What the hell is this?" David demanded, waving the papers in my direction. "Asset freeze. Financial disclosure. Have you completely lost your mind?" I remained seated on the sofa, forcing my voice to stay level and controlled. "I filed those petitions to protect our marital assets while we address some concerns I have about our marriage." "Concerns?" David's voice rose to a near shout. "You're freezing our bank accounts based on concerns. Do you have any idea what this could do to my career? To my reputation? I'm aware this creates complications for you," I replied, surprised by how calm I sounded despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "But I've discovered some financial irregularities that need to be addressed through proper legal channels." David stared at me as if I'd suddenly begun speaking a foreign language. The woman who had always deferred to his judgment, who had never challenged his decisions or questioned his explanations, was asserting herself in ways that clearly caught him completely off guard. "Financial irregularities," he repeated, his tone shifting from anger to something approaching panic. "What are you talking about? I handle all our finances perfectly responsibly." I pulled out a folder containing copies of the bank statements I'd organized, setting it on the coffee table between us. "The $37,000 you've transferred to an account I wasn't aware of. The insurance policy changes. The credit card charges for expenses that don't benefit our household. Those irregularities." David's face went pale as he realized the extent of my knowledge. He moved toward the folder as if to examine its contents, then seemed to think better of it, stepping back and running his hands through his hair in obvious distress. "You've been spying on me," he said, his voice now carrying a note of wounded indignation. "Going through my personal financial records, violating my privacy. How long has this been going on?" "Long enough to understand that you've been systematically preparing for a major life change without including me in those preparations," I replied. "Long enough to realize that many of your explanations about working late and business obligations haven't been entirely truthful." The accusations hung in the air between us, and I watched David's expression cycle through several emotions as he processed the implications of what I'd said. He was clearly trying to determine exactly how much I knew and what evidence I might possess that could damage him in legal proceedings. "I don't know what you think you've discovered," David said finally, attempting to regain his composure, but you're obviously misinterpreting normal business activities and personal financial management. The account you're referring to is related to investment opportunities that require separate handling for tax purposes. His explanation was delivered with practiced confidence, but I could see the desperation underlying his attempt to rationalize what couldn't be logically explained away. The David I'd married would never have opened secret accounts or made major financial decisions without consulting me, regardless of tax implications or investment strategies. What about Jessica Martinez? I asked quietly, watching his reaction carefully. The blood drained from David's face so completely that I worried he might actually faint. His mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound, and his hands began to shake visibly. Whatever composure he'd been trying to maintain evaporated entirely in the face of this direct challenge. What about her? He managed finally, but his voice cracked on the words. I saw you together at the Christmas party, I said. I heard your conversation about timeline and making things official. I saw you give her a ring. David collapsed into the armchair across from me as if his legs could no longer support his weight. For several long moments he stared at his hands while I waited for him to formulate some response to being confronted with undeniable evidence of his deception. It's not what you think, he said eventually, though he couldn't meet my eyes as he spoke. Jessica and I have developed a close working relationship, and sometimes the boundaries became blurred. But it's not a serious affair, it's just a temporary distraction that got out of hand. The lies continued to flow from him even when caught red-handed, confirming Margaret's prediction that David would attempt to minimize and rationalize his behavior, rather than accept responsibility for his choices. His characterization of an 8-month relationship involving rings and future planning as a temporary distraction was so absurd, it was almost insulting. I've read your messages to each other, I said, producing copies of the Facebook conversations I'd printed. The ones where you discuss your timeline for filing divorce papers in March. The ones where you describe our marriage as emotionally defunct and discuss apartments you want to rent together. David's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock and what appeared to be genuine fear. He'd clearly believed his electronic communications were private and secure, never imagining that his careful documentation of the affair would become evidence in legal proceedings. You accessed my private messages, he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Your laptop was open in your study, I replied. I didn't hack anything or violate any passwords. You left your communications accessible, and I read them. David buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking in what might have been sobs or simply the release of nervous tension. The confident, successful marketing executive had been replaced by someone who looked broken and defeated, confronted with the undeniable reality of his exposed deceptions. How long have you known? He asked, without looking up. Since the Christmas party, I answered. I've spent the past week trying to understand the scope of the situation and protect my interests before taking any formal action. Jesus, Emma. David finally raised his head, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with something that might have been genuine remorse. I never meant for you to find out this way. I was trying to figure out how to handle everything responsibly, how to minimize the damage to everyone involved. By secretly planning our divorce while pretending to work on our marriage, I asked. By transferring money to hidden accounts and changing insurance beneficiaries without my knowledge. That's your idea of handling things responsibly. David flinched at each accusation, unable to deny the factual accuracy of my statements. The elaborate web of lies he'd constructed over the past 8 months had collapsed completely, leaving him exposed and vulnerable in ways he'd clearly never anticipated. I know how it looks, he said desperately. But I was trying to protect you, to make sure you'd be taken care of financially when we separated. The separate account was meant to ensure you'd have immediate access to funds without having to go through complicated legal procedures. Even in confession, David couldn't stop trying to reframe his deception as consideration for my welfare. The same man who had characterized me as emotionally needy and professionally unfocused in his messages to Jessica was now claiming his secret financial maneuvering had been designed to protect my interests. That's an interesting interpretation, I said dryly. But it doesn't align with the messages where you discuss minimizing your financial exposure and ensuring Jessica's security in your future together. David winced again, realizing that his documented communications contradicted any attempt to portray his actions as benevolent. The evidence was too comprehensive and too damning to allow for the kind of selective reinterpretation he was attempting. "What do you want from me?"
he asked finally, his voice hollow and defeated. "What's it going to take to resolve this situation without destroying both our lives completely?" The question revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of our circumstances. David still believed this was a negotiation where he could offer concessions in exchange for my cooperation in managing the scandal quietly. He didn't yet grasp that our marriage was already destroyed and that my priority was now protecting myself rather than protecting his reputation or professional standing. "I want an honest accounting of all our financial assets," I said. "I want transparency about your relationship with Jessica and your actual plans for our future. And I want a fair division of everything we've built together over 13 years of marriage." "And if I provide all that?" David asked hopefully. "If I'm completely honest about everything and we work out a reasonable settlement, can we handle this privately without involving the courts or making it public?" I studied his face, seeing the desperate hope that he could still control the narrative and minimize the consequences of his choices. David had spent months planning to blindside me with divorce papers on his timeline and terms, but now that I'd taken the initiative, he wanted to negotiate for discretion and damage control. "That depends on how honest you're actually willing to be," I replied, "and whether the financial disclosure reveals additional deceptions I haven't discovered yet." David nodded eagerly, apparently interpreting my response as willingness to consider a private settlement. "I'll give you access to everything. The separate account, the insurance policies, all my communication with Jessica. I'll be completely transparent about our plans and timeline." "Plans that didn't include consulting me about the end of our marriage?" I asked. "I was going to talk to you," David insisted. I was trying to figure out the right way to approach the subject without causing unnecessary pain. "I know that sounds inadequate now, but I genuinely thought I was being considerate of your feelings." The absurdity of his explanation would have been laughable if it weren't so hurtful. David had convinced himself that planning our divorce in secret while maintaining the pretense of working on our marriage was somehow more considerate than honest communication about his dissatisfaction and desire to end our relationship. "When exactly were you planning to have this conversation?" I pressed. "Before or after you filed divorce papers in March?" David's silence confirmed that he'd intended to present me with a fait accompli, probably accompanied by a settlement offer designed to expedite my agreement rather than ensure fairness. His consideration for my feelings extended only to managing my reaction to his predetermined decisions. "I want you to understand that I never intended to hurt you," David said finally. "What happened with Jessica wasn't planned. It just developed naturally as we worked together, and by the time I realized how serious it had become, I was already in too deep to handle it gracefully." "Serious enough to buy her a ring and plan a future together," I observed. "The ring was an impulse," David claimed. "Jessica was feeling insecure about the secrecy of our relationship, and I wanted to reassure her that my intentions were genuine. But I hadn't thought through all the implications of what that gesture meant or how to handle the practical complications." His explanation painted him as a victim of circumstances rather than someone who had made deliberate choices over many months. David's refusal to accept full responsibility for his actions suggested that any reconciliation would require me to share blame for the deterioration of our marriage, despite his being the one who had chosen to pursue another woman instead of addressing our problems honestly. "What are you going to tell Jessica about this situation?" I asked, curious about how he planned to manage his relationship with her now that his deception had been exposed. David looked genuinely distressed by this question, as if the impact on Jessica's feelings was a significant concern for him. "I don't know," he admitted. "She's going to be devastated when she learns that our timeline has been accelerated and that our relationship is now going to be scrutinized in legal proceedings." His priority on Jessica's emotional well-being, even in this moment of reckoning with his wife, confirmed everything I'd learned about where his true loyalties lay. The woman he claimed to love was worried about legal scrutiny and altered timelines, while the woman he'd betrayed was supposed to be understanding about his consideration for his mistress's feelings. "Perhaps you should have considered those complications before giving her a ring and making promises about your future together," I suggested. David nodded miserably, finally seeming to understand the magnitude of the mess he'd created through his attempts to maintain both relationships simultaneously.
The confident executive who controlled complex marketing campaigns had proved incapable of managing his personal life with even minimal competence. We sat in silence for several minutes while David absorbed the reality of his situation. The legal papers on the coffee table between us represented the formal beginning of proceedings that would dissect 13 years of shared life and determine how our accumulated assets and obligations would be divided. There was no going back to the comfortable lies that had sustained our marriage through his months of deception. "I'll need to call Jessica," David said eventually. "She deserves to know what's happening before she hears about it through office gossip or legal notifications." "That's between you and her," I replied. "But any communication that relates to our marital assets or legal proceedings should go through my attorney rather than being handled privately." David winced at the reminder that we were now adversaries in a legal process rather than partners trying to resolve personal problems. The woman who had always trusted his judgment and deferred to his expertise was asserting herself as an equal party with independent representation and her own strategic interests. "Who's your attorney?" he asked. "Margaret Chen," I replied, watching his expression change as he recognized the name. "Jesus, Emma, Margaret Chen. She's known for absolutely destroying men in divorce proceedings. She's ruthless. She's thorough," I corrected. "And she believes in protecting her clients' interests aggressively. Given what I've discovered about your financial preparations and timeline, aggressive representation seems appropriate." David slumped back in his chair, apparently realizing that his hope for a quiet, controlled resolution had been naive. Margaret Chen's involvement meant that every aspect of his finances and behavior would be scrutinized professionally, with no possibility of the kind of damage control he'd hoped to negotiate privately. "Is there any chance we could try counseling first?" David asked desperately. "Before this gets completely out of hand legally, maybe if we worked with someone professionally, we could find a way to address the underlying problems in our marriage that led to this situation." The suggestion was too little, too late, offered only after his deception had been exposed and legal proceedings had begun. David wanted counseling not to save our marriage but to create a record of attempting reconciliation that might favorably influence divorce negotiations or public perception of his character. "Our marriage ended when you decided to pursue another woman instead of addressing whatever dissatisfaction you were feeling," I replied. "Counseling might have been valuable 8 months ago, before you chose deception over communication." David's face crumpled as he finally seemed to accept that I was serious about ending our marriage rather than trying to salvage it despite his betrayal. The realization that his actions had irreversible consequences appeared to be genuinely surprising to him, suggesting a level of compartmentalization that bordered on delusional. "I love you, Emma," he said quietly. "Despite everything that's happened, despite my mistakes with Jessica, I do love you. I hope you'll remember that when all this legal stuff is finished." His declaration felt hollow after everything I'd learned about his real feelings and plans. The man who had described our marriage as emotionally defunct and characterized me in cruel terms to his mistress was now claiming love as if the word could somehow undo months of calculated deception. "Love isn't just a feeling, David," I replied. "It's a choice you make every day about how to treat the person you claim to care about. Your choices over the past 8 months have made your priorities very clear." The conversation ended with David gathering his things and leaving for what he claimed would be a hotel until we could work out temporary living arrangements. As his car disappeared down our street, I realized that the confrontation I'd been dreading had actually felt liberating rather than devastating. The truth was finally out in the open, and I no longer had to pretend that our marriage was anything other than what it had become. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my new downtown loft, sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows as I prepared coffee for my first client meeting of the day. The space was smaller than the Tudor house David and I had shared, but every element reflected my personal taste without compromise. Clean lines, natural materials, and carefully curated artwork created an environment that felt authentically mine for the first time in years. The divorce had been finalized 3 weeks earlier with terms that exceeded even Margaret's optimistic predictions. David's documented deception and financial misconduct had convinced the judge to award me 60% of our marital assets, plus substantial spousal support that would allow me to rebuild my life without financial stress.
The hidden account, the insurance changes, and his cruel characterizations of our marriage in those Facebook messages had made him appear calculating and dishonest in ways that damaged his credibility on every contested issue. My design business had flourished once I could devote full attention to it without the emotional drain of maintaining a failing marriage. 3 major commercial projects and a feature in Architectural Digest had established my reputation as someone who understood both aesthetic vision and practical implementation. The referrals were steady, the work was challenging, and I felt intellectually engaged in ways I'd forgotten were possible. The doorbell chimed, announcing the arrival of Patricia Chen, who had become both a client and an unexpected friend during the chaos of my divorce proceedings. She was renovating her own home after her own marriage ended, and we'd bonded over our shared experience of rebuilding lives that had been defined by relationships that no longer served us. The samples arrived yesterday, I said, leading Patricia to the dining table where fabric swatches and paint chips were arranged in careful combinations. I think you're going to love the direction we're heading. Patricia examined the materials with the same attention to detail that had made her successful in HR management. These colors feel so much lighter than anything I would have chosen when Michael was involved in decorating decisions, she observed. It's amazing how much our aesthetic choices were influenced by trying to accommodate someone else's preferences. I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The burgundy velvet dress that had hung in my closet for months after the Christmas party had finally been donated to charity, along with many other items that reminded me of the woman I'd been when my primary goal was pleasing David rather than expressing my authentic self. Color psychology is fascinating, I replied, pointing to the warm grays and soft blues we'd selected for her living spaces. These tones create calm and clarity, which feels appropriate for this stage of your life. We spent an hour reviewing plans and timelines, and Patricia left with obvious excitement about the transformation ahead. As I cleaned up the materials, my phone buzzed with a text from Rachel, my sister, who had become my closest confidant during the divorce proceedings. The message contained a link to a local business journal article with the headline "Henderson and Associates loses major client amid internal restructuring." I clicked through to read that Morrison Industries had terminated their contract following what the article described as irregularities in account management and concerns about professional conduct within the marketing team. David's affair with Jessica had eventually become office gossip that reached Morrison's executives, who decided they couldn't trust a firm where senior personnel were involved in workplace relationships that compromised professional judgment. The irony wasn't lost on me that David's pursuit of what he thought would enhance his career had actually destroyed the professional success he'd valued above our marriage. According to Rachel's follow-up text, David had been forced to resign from Henderson and Associates and was currently working at a much smaller firm for significantly less money. Jessica had also left, though whether voluntarily or under pressure wasn't clear from the available information. Their relationship had apparently survived the professional consequences, but the financial realities of their situation were quite different from what they'd planned during those optimistic months of secret messages and elaborate deceptions. I felt neither satisfaction nor sympathy about David's professional difficulties. His choices had led to predictable consequences, and I'd moved beyond caring about the details of his new circumstances. The man who had seemed so important to my happiness for 13 years had become irrelevant to my daily life in ways that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. My phone rang with a call from Margaret, who was wrapping up the final administrative details of our divorce settlement. "The house sale closed this morning," she reported. "After paying off the mortgage and dividing the proceeds according to our agreement, your portion comes to $238,000. Combined with your other assets and the spousal support arrangement, you're in an excellent position financially." The Tudor house that had represented our shared dreams for so many years had sold quickly to a young couple who reminded me painfully of David and me during our optimistic early marriage. I'd felt melancholy walking through the empty rooms for the final time, remembering dinner parties and holiday celebrations that had once seemed so important. But the sadness was clean and finite, grief for what we'd lost rather than regret for what I'd chosen to leave behind. "Thank you for everything, Margaret," I said. "I couldn't have navigated this process without your guidance and support." "You're stronger than you realized when you first came to my office," Margaret replied.
Most women take much longer to develop the clarity and strategic thinking you demonstrated throughout this process. After ending the call, I walked to the windows that overlooked the bustling downtown district where my new life was taking shape. The view included the building where Henderson and Associates was located, though I felt no urge to look for David's car in the parking garage or wonder about his current activities. That part of my story was finished, replaced by possibilities I was creating through my own choices and efforts. The woman who had carefully selected a burgundy dress to please her husband at a Christmas party no longer existed. In her place was someone who understood that the most important approval had never been his but her own. Someone who had learned that surviving betrayal required not just discovering the truth but having the courage to act on it decisively. The ring David had given Jessica, the secret accounts, the cruel messages about our marriage, all of it had served as unwitting gifts that forced me to reclaim a strength I'd forgotten I possessed. Sometimes the most devastating betrayals become the catalysts for the most meaningful transformations, clearing away comfortable illusions to make space for authentic growth. As evening approached, I prepared for a dinner date with someone I'd met through Patricia's book club, a professor of art history whose intelligence and kindness felt like a welcome contrast to the manipulation and deception I'd endured. The relationship was new and careful, built on honesty and mutual respect rather than the desperate need to be completed by another person. I selected a dress in deep emerald green, a color I'd always loved but rarely worn during my marriage because David preferred me in more conservative tones. The woman in the mirror looked confident and genuinely happy, someone who had learned that the best relationships enhance who you already are rather than requiring you to become someone else. The doorbell rang, and I felt the familiar flutter of anticipation that comes with new possibilities. The future stretched ahead, unmarked by others' expectations or limitations, waiting to be shaped by choices made with full knowledge of my own worth and capabilities. I opened the door to greet whatever came next, no longer afraid of locked doors or hidden keys, but ready to build something better on the foundation of hard-won wisdom and uncompromising self-respect. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.